Valentinian chosen emperor, AD 364. Having spared no pains in relating the course of events up to the beginning of the present epoch, I had thought it best to steer clear of more familiar matters, partly to escape the dangers which often attend on truth, and partly to avoid capering criticism of my work by those who feel injured by the omission of insignificant detail, such things, for example, as the emperor's table talk, or the reason for the public punishment of soldiers. Such folk also complain if in a wide-ranging geographical description some small strongholds are not mentioned, or if one does not give the names of all who attended the inauguration of the urban prefect, or passes over a number of similar details which are beneath the dignity of history. The task of history is to deal with prominent events, not to delve into trivial minutiae, which it is as hopeless to try to investigate as to count the small indivisible bodies as Greeks call atoms, which fly through empty space. Fears of this kind led some older writers not to publish in their lifetime eloquent accounts they had composed of various events within their knowledge. For this we have the unimpeachable testimony of Cicero in a letter to Cornelius Nepos. Now, however, I will proceed with the rest of my story, treating the ignorance of the vulgar with the contempt it deserves. The dreadful period of uncertainty came to a sad end with the death of these emperors in so brief a space. Jovian's body was embalmed and sent to Constantinople to be interred with the bodies of his predecessors, and the army marched to Nicaea, the metropolis of Bithynia. Here the leading civil and military officials, some of whom entertained vain hopes for themselves, were constrained by their responsibility for the general good to look for a ruler of tried and dignity. The name of Aquitius, tribune of the first division of the Scutari, was faintly hinted at by a small party, but failed to obtain the approval of the more influential, who thought him too much of a rough diamond. Their fickle thoughts then turned towards Janurius, the chief commissary in Illyricum, and a relation of Jovian, but he too was rejected on the grounds that he was too far away. Finally, by divine inspiration, Valentinian was unanimously chosen as a man who possessed the necessary qualifications. He commanded the second division of the Scutari, and had been left behind at Ankara to follow later in accordance with orders. It was agreed that his election would best serve the interests of the state, and messengers were sent to hasten his arrival. For 10 days the empire was without a ruler, a state of affairs which the soothsayer Marcus announced at Rome after inspecting the entrails of a sacrifice. In the interval, Equitus took steps to ensure that no attempt should be made to overturn this decision, and that the favour of the troops, which is always uncertain, should not be diverted to the choice of someone on the spot. He was supported by Leo, who was still serving as military treasurer under de Galliaf, the master of horse, and was later to be a disastrous master of the offices. These two did everything in their power to uphold the decision of the whole army, being themselves Pannonians and partisans of the emperor designate. When Valentinian arrived in response to the summons, he delayed the implementation of his election, either from a presentiment, as it was generally thought, or under the influence of repeated dreams. He would not be seen or appear in public next day because it happened to be the intercalary day of February, which he had heard was sometimes unlucky for the Roman state. Valentinian's ascension When the day which some think unlucky for the beginning of great enterprises had passed, and everything was coming on, everyone readily accepted a proposal by the prefect Sallustius that no one who had held high office or had been thought to nurse ambitious designs should appear in public the next morning on pain of death, after a night passed in chagrin by many who were tormented by empty hopes. The whole army was assembled at dawn. Valentinian appeared on the parade ground and was allowed to mount the high platform which had been erected. His claims as a man of substance were most cordially received, and he was proclaimed ruler of the empire by a form of popular election. Wearing the imperial robes and a crown, he was hailed as Augustus, with all the applause to be expected from men's delight at this new development, and made ready to address the audience in a prepared speech. But as he stretched out his arm to command a hearing, a deep murmur arose. The sentries and maniples began to heckle, and the whole body of cohorts ostensibly insisted that a second emperor should at once be nominated. Some thought that a few men had been hired to mount this demonstration in favour of disappointed candidates, but there are strong grounds for rejecting this supposition. The cries which were heard did not come from a hired clique, but expressed the unanimous wish of the whole throng, which had learned from recent experience how precarious is the position of those in high places. It looked as if what began as a murmur among the dissatisfied army would end in violence, and the insolence of the troops, which sometimes breaks out into acts of outrage, excited alarm. But Valentinian, who feared this more than anything, quickly raised his right hand and ventured with all the vigour of an emperor whose confidence was unshaken to reprimand some of them as obstinate mutineers. Then he delivered his projected speech without further interruption. Gallant defenders of our provinces, it is and will always be my pride and boast that I owe to your courage the rule of the Roman world, a position which I neither desired nor sought out, but for which you have judged me to be the best qualified. While the empire lacked a governor, the responsibility was yours. You have discharged it splendidly in the general interest by raising to the summit of power a man who you know by experience has lived from his earliest youth to his present mature age with honour and integrity. Now I must ask you to listen to me quietly while I explain in simple words what I think the welfare of the state requires. I do not doubt nor dispute that there are cogent reasons for the co-option of a colleague with equal status to meet all contingencies. I am only human, and I dread the accumulated responsibilities and the various uncertainties that await me. But above all we must strive for harmony, which brings strength out of weakness, and we shall easily attain it if you will be patient and fair-minded, and allow me the free exercise of my proper power. I shall use my best efforts, and fortune, which attends on wise plans, will, I trust, reward my careful search with a man of steady character. It is a sound maxim, not only in affairs of state, where the risks are greatest and most numerous, but also in private and everyday matters, that a prudent man should not admit a stranger to his friendship until he has tested him, rather than testing him after he has taken him into his confidence. I promise you this, with every hope of a happier future. For your part, you must maintain your discipline and recruit your spirit and strength. While your winter rest gives you the opportunity, you shall receive without delay what is due to you from my nomination as emperor. By this speech, which gained force from its unexpected firmness, the emperor won over his whole audience, even those who shortly before had been most clamorously demanding another course, adopted his advice and escorted him to the palace, surrounded by eagles and standards, and a splendid retinue of various ranks. He was already an object of fear. The urban prefecture of Apronion While fate was giving this turn to events in the east, Apronian was in charge of the Eternal City. He was an upright and strict official, and among all the responsibilities which fall on the urban prefect, made it his prime concern to arrest sorcerers, who at that time were becoming more numerous. Those who after trial were found plainly guilty of inflicting harm on others he punished with death after they had revealed their accomplices, his intention being to make an example of a few and to flush out, through fear of a similar fate, any who remained in hiding. He is said to have been particularly active in this matter for the following reason. He had been appointed by Julian while the latter was still in Syria, and on his way to take up his post had lost an eye, an injury which he ascribed to the practice of black magic. His resentment, though justifiable, was exceptionally strong, and led him to inquire into these and other crimes with great energy. Some thought him savage, because on occasion he investigated the gravest offences even when the people were thronging into the amphitheatre for the races. Finally, after several crimes of this sort had been visited with punishment, a charioteer called Ammianus was convicted on his own confession of having apprenticed his young son to a sorcerer to be taught black arts forbidden by law, so that his father could have help available at home and no one need be the wiser. Ammianus was condemned to death, but owing to the slackness of the executioner, suddenly escaped and took refuge in a Christian chapel, from which he was dragged out and immediately beheaded. But though at this point measures were taken for the prompt suppression of crimes of this kind, and none or very few of its practitioners dared to defy the vigour of the authorities, at a later time monstrous wickedness throve on long-continued impunity, and licence went so far that a certain senator, who followed Ammianus' example and was convicted of having made what amounted to a contract with a teacher of black magic for the instruction of his slave in these abominable mysteries, bought himself off from execution by payment of a large sum, according to common report. And this same man, after escaping in the way described, so far from being ashamed of his wicked life, has taken no pains to wipe out the stain, but behaves as if he were the only innocent man in a vicious society. He rides about the streets on a horse with splendid trappings, and is followed to this day by a train of slaves, claiming the attention of curious eyes by a new sort of distinction. He might in fact be a second Dullius, who, we are told, after the glorious outcome of his sea fight, assumed the privilege of having a flutist play soft music before him as he returned home after dinner. But under the rule of Apronian, there was such a constant abundance of commodities that not the faintest murmur ever arose, as it frequently does at Rome, about any scarcity of provisions. Valens chosen by his brother as co-emperor. Valentinian, having, as I said, been proclaimed emperor in Bithynia, gave orders to march on the next day but one. Then, summoning his chief officers with the apparent intention of being entirely guided by their advice, rather than by his own wishes, he asked whom they thought he should take as his colleague in the empire. All were silent until de Galliaf, then commander of the cavalry, made this bold answer: "Your Highness, if you love your kin, you have a brother, but if you love the state, look carefully for a man to invest with the purple." Valentinian was ruffled by this reply, but held his peace and dissembled his intentions. After a forced march, he entered Nicomedia, and on the 1st of March appointed his brother Valens supervisor of the stables with the rank of tribune. Then on the 28th of March, when he had reached Constantinople, after much heart-searching and in the belief that he was unequal to the pressure of urgent business and that there was no time to be lost, he conducted Valens outside the walls and, with the approval of the whole army, for no one dared to object, proclaimed him Augustus. He dressed Valens in the imperial robes, placed a diadem on his head, and, sharing the same carriage, took him back to the city as his legitimate partner in power. In fact, however, Valens proved more like an obsequious lieutenant, as the subsequent narrative will reveal. All this went off without any disturbance, but then both emperors were seized by a violent fever. When after a long illness their recovery was assured, being more apt to set inquiries on foot than to ensure tranquillity, they commissioned Satius, master of the offices, a raw Dalmatian, and Viventius of Cilicia, then questor, to conduct a strict investigation into what they suspected to be the cause of their ailment. A rumour persisted that the suggestion that they were the victims of black magic was made in order to discredit the memory of the Emperor Julian and his friends. But this insinuation was easily disposed of, since not a shred of evidence could be found for the existence of a plot. During this period, practically the whole Roman world heard the trumpet call of war, as savage peoples stirred themselves and raided the frontiers nearest to them. The Alemanni were ravaging Gaul and Raetia simultaneously. The Sarmatians and Quadi were devastating Pannonia. The Picts, Saxons, Scots, and Atticotti were bringing continual misery upon Britain. The Austroni and other Moorish peoples were attacking Africa with more than their usual violence, and predatory bands of Goths were plundering Thrace and Moesia. The king of Persia was laying unlawful hands on Armenia and sparing no effort to bring that country once more under his rule. His pretext was that since Jovian, with whom he had made a treaty of peace, was dead, nothing ought to stand in his way and prevent him recovering what he claimed had formerly belonged to his ancestors. Division of functions between the two emperors. After a quiet winter, the two emperors, one of whom had been formally elected and the other co-opted as his colleague, though more in appearance than in reality, crossed Thrace in perfect harmony and reached Nis. There, in a suburb called Mediana, 3 miles from the city, they shared the commanders between them in view of their coming parting. Jovianus, who had previously been promoted by Julian to the command in Gaul, and Dagaliath, who had been advanced to the same rank by Jovian, fell to the lot of Valentinian, whose wishes in the matter were decisive. Victor, however, who also owed his promotion to the last-named emperor, was to accompany Valens to the east, together with Orynthius. Lupicinus, also promoted master of cavalry by Jovian, was in charge of the defence of the eastern provinces. At the same time, Aquitius, who was not yet a master of troops but only a count, was given the command in Illyricum, and Cyrenian, who had left the service but was now recalled because he was a Pannonian, was allotted to Valens to command his bodyguard. These arrangements were accompanied by a division of the troops between the two emperors. The brothers then entered Sirmium. The court officials were shared in accordance with the wishes of the senior, and Valentinian departed to Milan, Valens to Constantinople. Salutius governed the east as Praetorian prefect, Mamertinus Italy with Africa and Illyricum, Germanian the provinces of Gaul. During their stay in the respective capitals, both brothers assumed for the first time the consular robes. The whole year which followed inflicted heavy losses on the Roman state. The Alemanni violated the German frontier. The reason for their exceptional hostility was that the envoys whom they sent to Roman headquarters to receive the regular gifts that they had come to expect were fobbed off with smaller and cheaper presents, which they thought unworthy of them and threw away in a rage. After rough handling by Ursastius, master of the offices, a cruel and passionate man, they went home with an exaggerated account of the matter and roused their savage countrymen to revenge the insulting treatments they had received. About the same time, or soon after, Procopius set on foot a revolution in the East, and news of both these events reached Valentinian on the same day as he was approaching Paris at about the 1st of November. He at once sent de Galliaf to encounter the Alemanni, who had retired to a distance without loss after devastating the places nearest to them. But he was in much doubt how best to suppress Procopius' coup before it gathered strength, especially since he did not know whether Valens was still alive or whether Procopius' attempt was the result of Valens' death. The tribune Antonius, who commanded in central Dacia, had sent Equitus a report which contained only a vague account of what he had heard, and Equitius in turn had passed this on to the emperor in bald terms, before he had ascertained the whole truth. On receipt of this news, Valentinian promoted Equitius to the rank of master and decided to return himself to Illyricum, in case the rebels should overrun Thrace and invade Pannonia with an already formidable force. His fears were greatly increased by an example from the recent past. He remembered how Julian, thinking nothing of the opposition of an emperor who had always been successful in civil war, had surpassed all hopes and expectations by the incredible speed with which he flew from city to city. But his burning anxiety to return was modified by the opinions of those closest to him, who advised and begged him not to expose Gaul to the barbarians who threatened it with destruction, or to let this be a reason for abandoning provinces which were much in need of support. Their pleas were seconded by deputations from cities of note, imploring him not to leave them unprotected in times of such doubt and uncertainty. His presence could save them from extreme peril, and his mighty name would strike fear into the Germans. At last, after much consideration, he gave in to the views of the majority, saying more than once that Procopius was merely his own and his brother's enemy, whereas the Alemanni were enemies of the whole Roman world. So he decided to make no move for the moment outside the boundaries of Gaul. He advanced as far as Rheims, but he was anxious about the possibility of a sudden invasion of Africa, and decided to send Neoterius, at the same time a notary but afterwards a consul, and Massacurio, a member of the general staff, to defend it. Massacurio was chosen because he had been trained in Africa under his father, the former Count Cretio, and knew the weak spots. To these two he joined Gordientus, an officer of the Scutari, whom he knew and trusted from of old. Seeing then that sad storms broke out at one and the same time on both fronts, I shall arrange the details of each separately in due order, dealing first with the East and afterwards with the campaign against the barbarians. Most of the events in East and West occurred during the same months, and to dart suddenly from one place to another would be totally confusing and plunge the course of the events into utter obscurity. Procopius' career and usurpation. Procopius came of a noble family and was born and bred in Cilicia. Since he was related to Julian, who was afterwards emperor, he attracted attention from his first entry into public life, and being of unblemished character, though reserved and silent, served with distinction for a long time as notary and tribune. His prospects of obtaining an important position were about to be realized, when the changes which followed the death of Constantius made him a kinsman of the emperor. He was promoted to the rank of count and began to entertain loftier ambitions, and it became clear that if he had the chance he would disturb the public peace. When Julian invaded Persia, he left Procopius in Mesopotamia with Sebastian, who was to share with him the command of a strong force. There was a dark rumour, never confirmed by any reliable evidence, that he was told by Julian to be guided by the course of events and to take immediate steps to have himself proclaimed emperor if the worst came to the worst. Procopius carried out these orders with loyalty and prudence, but when he heard that Julian had been fatally wounded and Jovian raised to the power, and a false report got about that in his last moments Julian had expressed a wish that Procopius should take the helm, he feared that this would be enough to bring him to death without a trial, and disappeared from sight. His alarm reached its height after the death of the other Jovian, the chief notary, who, he learned, had been nominated by a few soldiers as a worthy candidate for the empire after Julian's death, and had come to a frightful end because from that moment he was suspected of revolutionary designs. Hearing that great efforts were being made to find him, Procopius, determined to avoid incurring an even heavier load of ill will, and withdrew into the most remote seclusion. And he found that the emperor was trying still harder to discover his whereabouts. He had fallen from a lofty position and was tired of living the life of a wild beast and skulking through a rough country, where he was actually in need of food, and cut off from human society. So under the pressure of extreme necessity he made his way by a roundabout route to the neighbourhood of Chalcedon. Here he believed that he could find safe refuge by hiding in the house of Strategius, a senator who had been an officer in the palace and who was his firm friend. From this base he made excursions in the greatest possible secrecy to Constantinople. This emerged from the evidence of the same Strategius when the accomplices in the plot were subjected to repeated torture. Procopius, who concealed his identity by his unkempt and emaciated appearance, collected like a clever spy the gossip that was flying about. Men are always disconcerted with the existing state of affairs, and many accused Valens of an inordinate desire to enrich himself at the expense of others. The harshness of the emperor found a deadly stimulus in his father-in-law, Petronius, a former commander of the legion Marcellinus, who had been advanced at a bound to the rank of patrician. He was as twisted morally as physically, and consumed with sadistic eagerness to strip one and all of their possessions. After exquisite tortures, he extracted penalties fourfold from innocent and guilty alike, hunting out debts as far back as the time of the Emperor Aurelian, and grievously upset if he let anyone escape unharmed. A further odious feature of his insufferable character was that, while battening on the woes of others, he was deaf to all prayers and ferociously cruel. His heart was of stone, and he was incapable of either speaking or listening to reason. He was more hated than Cleander, Commodus Prefect, who we are told ruined the fortunes of many by his inane arrogance. More repressive than Plautian, who held the same office under Severus, and whose overweening pride would have brought all to ruin if he had not perished by the avenging sword. The disastrous events inspired by Petronius, which caused the closure of many houses both rich and poor under Valens, together with the fear of worse to come, made a deep impression in both provincials and soldiers, who had equal cause to complain. Though no one expressed it openly, the hope that Providence would bring about a change was universal. All this came to the ears of Procopius while he was in hiding. Thinking that a lucky turn of events could easily bring him to the top, he lay low like a beast of prey, ready to pounce as soon as he saw a possible opening. While he was eagerly maturing his plans, chance presented him with an exceptionally favourable opportunity. The winter was over, and Valens had already crossed the frontier of Bithynia on his way to Syria, when he heard from his generals that the Goths, who had been left undisturbed and were consequently very wild, were combining to violate the borders of Thrace. In order not to interrupt his own journey, Valens ordered a sufficient force of horse and foot to the area threatened by the barbarians. Procopius, worn out by hardships and thinking that even a cruel death would be better than the misery he was suffering, resolved to hazard everything on a single throw. The emperor was at a distance, and the troops allotted to the campaign in Thrace would in the usual course of events spend 2 days in Constantinople. Among them were the Diventices and the junior Tungracini, and Procopius, dismissing all fears of the consequences, embarked in desperation on a deed of the utmost audacity. His plan was to seduce these legions from their allegiance through the agency of some acquaintances among them. It would be dangerous and difficult to address the whole body, and he therefore confined himself to only confiding in a few. These few succumbed to the lure of a huge reward and took a solemn oath to do everything he wished. They guaranteed a favourable reception by their comrades, with whom their long and meritorious service gave them commanding influence. So at break of day, Procopius, a prey to conflicting emotions, went to the baths of Anastasia, so called after Constantine's sister, where he knew that the legions were stationed, and where he was told by his confidants that at a nocturnal meeting they all had united in his support. His safety was unhesitatingly guaranteed, and he was received by a throng of venal soldiers who treated him with respect but kept him practically a prisoner. Like the Praetorians who took up the cause of Didius Julianus when he made a bid for the empire after the death of Pertinax, these men, keen not to lose any chance of profit, defended Procopius on his first steps towards his unlucky reign. There he stood, a shaken figure, which might have risen from the grave. No purple robe was available, and he was dressed in a gold-spangled tunic like a court official, though from the waist downwards he looked like a page. He wore purple shoes and carried a spear, with a shred of purple cloth in his left hand. Altogether he was a grotesque object, such as might suddenly appear on the stage in a satirical farce. Elevated in this ridiculous way to an honour rooted in dishonour, he addressed his supporters in tones of servile flattery, promising them ample wealth and high promotion as the first fruits of his rule. When he appeared in public escorted by a throng of armed men with raised standards, he held himself more confidently. All about him was the dismal din of clashing shields held by the troops in a dense mass over the very crests of their helmets, in case they should be pelted from the rooftops with stones or broken tiles. As he advanced more boldly, he met with neither resistance nor favour from the populace. Nevertheless, it was stirred by the pleasure naturally aroused in vulgar minds by novelty, and what contributed to excite it further was the detestation in which, as I said, Petronius was held because of his persecution of peoples of all classes by resurrecting long-buried transactions and shadowy debts. Ascending the tribunal amid general stupefaction, Procopius was alarmed by the gloomy silence which greeted him. It looked to him as if he had merely found a quicker road to death. He trembled all over. He could not find his voice, and stood for a long time without uttering a word. Finally he began with a few broken phrases, like a dying man, justifying himself by his relationship to the imperial family. These were received with a gentle murmur of approbation by a hired clique, and then by the tumultuous shouts of the people, whose impetuosity acclaimed him emperor. He went at once to the Senate House, where he found nobody of rank but only a few nobodies, and then hastened to the palace, another step on his ill-starred path. If some feel surprised that a reign rashly and thoughtlessly begun in such ridiculous circumstances should have brought such lamentable disaster on the state. It is because they are ignorant of previous history and suppose that this was the first time such a thing happened. In fact, it was in this way that Andriscus of Adrumitum, who was of the meanest origin, acquired the title of Pseudo-Philip and was the cause of a third serious war with Macedon, and that Elagabalus Antoninus sprang up at Amissa when the Emperor Macrinus was at Antioch. Similarly, the unexpected attack of Maximin resulted in the murder of Alexander Severus with his mother Mammia. So too the elder Gordian was rushed to the throne in Africa, but in panic at the dangers which threatened him, ended his life by hanging himself. Further success of Procopius. So dealers in cheap luxuries, servants and ex-servants in the palace, and veterans who had retired from the army to a more peaceful life were recruited, whether they were willing or not, for this extraordinary and hazardous adventure. Some, however, to whom anything seemed better than the present state of affairs, slipped out of the city unobserved and made as fast as they could for the emperor's camp. They were all outstripped by the exceptional speed of the notary Sophronius, afterwards prefect of Constantinople, who met Valens as he was about to leave Caesarea in Cappadocia for Antioch at the end of the hot season in Cilicia. Valens was naturally shocked and amazed at Sophronius' report and was persuaded to go to Galatia to take things in hand before they got too far. While Valens was making this hurried march, Procopius was spending nights and days of strenuous activity. He suborned a number of people who pretended to have come from the east and some from Gaul, and who unblushingly asserted that Valentinian was dead and that nothing now stood in the way of the new and universally popular emperor. Impudent seizure of power is often fortified by rapid action, and nothing which could inspire dread was left undone. Nebridius, who at the insistence of Petronius' party had recently succeeded Sallustius as Praetorian prefect, and Caesarius, urban prefect of Constantinople, were at once arrested and imprisoned. Phronomius and Euphrasius, both Gauls highly regarded for their intellectual accomplishments, were appointed urban prefect and master of the offices respectively. Gamerius and Agillo were recalled to the service and charged with the military administration, an unwise step, as their later treachery proved. It was feared that Count Julius, who commanded the forces in Thrace, was near enough to be able to crush the rebels if he heard of their doings, and an effective scheme was devised to forestall this danger. Nebridius from his prison was forced to write a letter apparently on the orders of Valens, summoning Julius to Constantinople for an important conference on the movements of the barbarians, and when he arrived he was put under close arrest. By this clever trick the warlike tribes of Thrace were won over without bloodshed, and proved a strong reinforcement to the rebel cause. After these successful steps, Araxius obtained the Praetorian prefecture by court favour, ostensibly because he was supported by his son-in-law Regilio. Many others were appointed to various offices at court and in the provincial administration, some against their will, but others because they put themselves forward and brought their promotion. As usual in times of civil strife, dispersion and blind ambition brought some of the dregs of the populace to the top, while others of noble birth crashed from the highest eminence into death or exile. Meanwhile, Valens, appalled by the dreadful news, was on his way back through Galatia, moving timidly and hesitatingly. When he heard what had happened at Constantinople, sudden terror affected his judgment, and he fell into such despair that he thought of casting off the heavy burden of his imperial robes, and would no doubt have done so had not he been deterred from this disgraceful course by his closest associates. Encouraged, however, by better men than himself, he set forward 2 regiments called Jovi and Victors to make a sudden assault on the rebel camp. As they approached, Procopius, who had returned from a visit to Nicaea, hurried to Mygdus, a place on the banks of the Sangarius, taking with him Divitenses and a mixed rabble of deserters, which he had collected in the course of a few days. The legions were about to join battle and were already exchanging volleys when Procopius rushed forward alone into the intervening space as if to challenge the enemy. By a stroke of luck he appeared to recognise a man called Vitilian in the opposing ranks. Whether he really knew him is uncertain. Greeted him warmly in Latin and asked him to step forward. Then he offered his right hand and kissed him, and to the astonishment of both sides spoke as follows: "So this is the traditional loyalty of Roman troops, this is the way in which you observe your solemn oaths. Can it be your wish, my brave fellows, that our people should draw their swords in such numbers for a stranger, that you and we should have to suffer grievous wounds to enable a degenerate Pannonian to carry all before him, and win a throne for which he never dared to entertain the faintest hope? Follow instead the representative of your imperial house, who has taken up arms in a just cause, not to seize what is another's, but to establish himself in possession of the power which is his by inheritance." These calm words pacified them all. Though they had come prepared for a fierce struggle, they lowered their standards and eagles and gladly went over to Procopius. Instead of raising the fearful war cry which barbarians call Berytus, they acclaimed him emperor. Crowding about him in the traditional way, they escorted him back to camp in complete harmony, swearing by Jupiter, the usual soldier's oath, that Procopius would be invincible. Procopius gains the provinces of Bithynia and Hellespont. This piece of good fortune was followed by another rebel success. The tribune Ramitalca, who had come over to Procopius and been put in charge of the palace, crossed the sea with his troops after careful preparation, landed at Helenopolis, the former Drepanum, and unexpectedly occupied Nicaea. Vaidemar, the former leader and king of the Alemanni, was sent to besiege Nicaea with a force trained for this kind of operation, while Valens himself proceeded to Nicomedia. Leaving this, he threw all his strength into an attack on Chalcedon, where he was received with a chorus of insults from the walls and the derisive nickname Sabrius, or beer swiller. Sabria is the poor man's drink in Illyricum and is a kind of beer made from barley or some other grain. Valens was about to abandon the siege owing to a lack of supplies and the obstinacy of the defenders, when the garrison of Nicaea suddenly opened their gates and sallied out under the bold leadership of Ramitalca. They routed a great part of the besiegers and hurried on to take Valens in the rear. The latter had not yet left the environs of Chalcedon, and the attempt would have succeeded had not he received warning of the destruction which threatened him, and eluded the pursuit of his foes, who were close on his heels, by a hasty retreat by way of the Saronesian lake and the winding river Gallus. By this reverse, Bithynia also fell into the hands of Procopius. Valens returned with all speed to Ankara. There he heard that Lupicinus was approaching from the east with a respectable force, and plucking up heart sent his best general Arinthius to encounter the enemy. When Arinthius reached Dadastana, the scene of Jovian's death, he suddenly saw Hyperchius with some troops in his front. Hyperchius had formerly served in the court kitchens, but being a friend of Procopius had now been put in command of a body of auxiliaries. Orinthus thought it beneath him to defeat so mean an opponent, and relying on his authority and his imposing stature, called out to the enemy to put their commander in irons themselves. Thus this mere shadow of a general was arrested by his own men. Meanwhile, an official of Valens' treasury called Venustus, who had been sent some time before to Nicomedia with money to pay the troops stationed in the east, heard of the disaster that had occurred, and judging the moment unpropitious for his errand, betook himself hastily to Cyzicus with what he had with him. There he happened to find Cyrenion, at that time commander of the household troops, who had been sent to guard the treasury. He had hurriedly collected a garrison and was trying to hold the city, which was famous for its ancient monuments and protected by an impregnable wall. Procopius had detached a strong force to swarm it in the hopes of adding the province of Hellespont to his gains in Bithynia. Success, however, was delayed by two factors. Arrows, slingshots, and other missiles inflicted heavy losses on the besieging forces, and to prevent the entrance of enemy warships, the defence had skilfully barred the mouth of the harbour with an iron chain of immense strength fastened at either end to the land. Finally, after officers and men had exhausted themselves in fierce fighting, a tribune called Aliso, a tried and skilful warrior, broke the boom in the following way. He fastened together 3 ships and protected their decks by a covering of shields arranged thus. In front, men stood on the thwarts with their shields closely interlocked above their heads. Behind them were others who stooped a little, and behind these again a third party who bent lower still in descending order, so that the rearmost squatted on their hams, and the whole looked like the side of an arched building. The object of this formation, which is used in assaulting walls, is that missiles and stones may glide down the slopes which it presents and run off like so much rain. By this device Aliso was protected for a time from the enemy's fire, and, being a man of prodigious physical strength, was able to hold a block of wood beneath the chain while he struck it great blows with an axe, and at last succeeded in bursting it asunder. A broad entrance was thus created, and the city lay open to attack. When later the author of the whole rebellion was killed and savage punishment inflicted on those who had taken part in it, the life of this same tribune was spared on account of this brilliant exploit, and he was retained in the service. Long afterwards he met his death in Isauria at the hands of bands of brigands. This feat of war having put Cyzicus at his disposal, Procopius hurried thither. He pardoned all who had resisted him except Cyrenion, whom he ordered to be put in irons and removed to strict imprisonment at Nicaea. Immediately afterwards he conferred on Hormisdas, a man of maturity beyond his years and son of the royal prince of that name, the rank of proconsul, with authority in both civil and military affairs as in earlier times. Hormisdas acted with characteristic mildness. By finding that he was about to be seized by a party of troops sent by Valens through the back country of Phrygia, he showed great energy in effecting his escape. He embarked on a ship which he had made ready in case of emergency, and carried off with him his wife, who narrowly escaped capture as she was following, but whom he saved by a heavy discharge of arrows. She was a woman of wealth and high birth, whose spotless reputation and heroic resolution later saved her husband from extreme danger. After this victory, Procopius' confidence knew no bounds. He forgot that before the day is out, a turn of fortune's wheel may plunge any man from happiness into the depths of misery. Hitherto he had spared the house of Arbitio as if it were his own, because he believed that Arbitio was on his side, but now he ordered it to be completely cleared of all its priceless furniture. He was aggrieved because on several occasions Arbitio had failed to come when he was sent for. pleading sickness and the infirmities of old age. The usurper feared that this might have serious consequences, yet although there was now nothing to prevent him from overrunning the eastern provinces with the free consent of their inhabitants, who were chafing at the harshness of the existing regime and eager to see a change, he wasted time trying to win over some cities in Asia and recruit experienced fundraisers, who he thought would be useful in the many great battles that he expected. He was in fact a sword that had lost its cutting edge. In this he was like Pescennius Niger, who dawdled in Syria, deaf to the frequent appeals of the people of Rome to rescue them in their dire need, and was defeated by Severus at the Gulf of Issus, the place in Cilicia where Alexander routed Darius. After being put to flight, Niger perished in a suburb of Antioch at the hands of a common soldier. Procopius betrayed and executed, AD 366. These were the events of midwinter in the consulship of Valentinian and Valens, but when spring came and Gratian, who was as yet unknown to public life, succeeded to the highest magistracy with De Gallia for colleague, Valens mobilized his forces, joined Lupicinus and his strong army of auxiliaries, and marched quickly to Pessinnius, a town formerly in Phrygia but now in Galatia, leaving a garrison to guard against any surprise in that area. He advanced over difficult country along the foot of Mount Olympus towards Lydia, intending to attack Gomorius, who was lazing away there. He met, however, with widespread and obstinate resistance, chiefly because his enemy carried about with him in a litter Constantius' small daughter and her mother Faustina, not only on the march but even into the line of battle, and in this way excited his men to fight more resolutely for the imperial family, with which he claimed to be himself connected. Just so the Macedonians, on the eve of one of their battles with the Illyrians, placed their infant king in his cradle behind their line, and from fear that he might be captured, crushed their opponents with all the greater energy. To counter this clever move and bolster his tottering cause, the emperor adopted a wise expedient. He urged the ex-consul Arbitio, who had long been in retirement, to come to him, in the hope that respect for one of Constantine's generals would abate the insolence of the rebels. He was not disappointed. Arbitio was everybody's senior in age and rank. He showed his venerable white head, calling Procopius a public enemy, but addressing his deluded followers, among whom were many potential deserters, as his own sons and partners in his early labours. He begged them to follow him, who they knew to be successful, like a father, rather than obey a worthless profligate who deserved to be abandoned and must shortly fall. When he heard of this, Gomorius, who might have given his enemies the slip and returned unharmed to his base, preferred to take advantage of the proximity of the emperor's camp to desert to him, pretending that he had been surprised by the sudden appearance of a large force and had been taken prisoner. Heartened by this, Valens advanced into Phrygia, and the two armies joined battle near Nicolia. While the issue was still undecided, Agilio turned the scale by suddenly changing sides. He was followed by many others who, in the very act of brandishing their pikes and swords, deserted to the emperor, holding their standards and shields reversed, which is a sure sign of defection. This totally unexpected event robbed Procopius of any hope of safety. He took to flight and hid in the recesses of the surrounding woods and mountains, accompanied by Florentius and the tribune Barcalba, who had won renown in the fiercest wars from the time of Constantius, and had been led into treason by necessity rather than inclination. The greater part of the night had passed, lightened by a moon which shone brightly from its first rising until dawn, and intensified Procopius's fears. All chance of escape was cut off. He was at his wit's end and sunk into despair. While he was bitterly reproaching fortune for his troubles, as men do in such straits, he was suddenly seized by his companions. At daybreak, they took him to the camp and handed him over, silent and stupefied, to the emperor. He was immediately beheaded, and so stilted the rising storm of civil war. His fate was that of Perperna, who killed Sertorius at table and enjoyed a brief spell of power, but was then dragged from the thickets where he was hiding, brought before Pompey, and put to death at his orders. In the prevailing mood of anger, which allowed no time for reflection, Florentius and Barbalca, who had surrendered Procopius, were also at once put to death. If they had betrayed their lawful emperor, justice herself could have found no fault with their execution, but, since their victim was generally acknowledged to be a rebel who had disturbed the peace of the realm, they ought to have been generously rewarded for a notable service. Procopius was 40 years and 10 months old when he died. He was tall and not bad-looking, though he stooped and kept his eyes to the ground as he walked. His austere and reserved character was like that of the Crassus who, according to Lucullus and Cicero, only once laughed in his life. A remarkable thing about him was that he went through life innocent of bloodshed. The usurper feared that this might have serious consequences, yet although there was now nothing to prevent him from overrunning the eastern provinces with the free consent of their inhabitants, who were chafing at the harshness of the existing regime and eager to see a change, he wasted time trying to win over some cities in Asia and recruit experienced fundraisers, who he thought would be useful in the many great battles that he expected. He was in fact a sword that had lost its cutting edge. In this he was like Pescennius Niger, who dawdled in Syria, deaf to the frequent appeals of the people of Rome to rescue them in their dire need, and was defeated by Severus at the Gulf of Issus, the place in Cilicia where Alexander routed Darius. After being put to flight, Niger perished in a suburb of Antioch at the hands of a common soldier. Procopius betrayed and executed, AD 366. These were the events of midwinter in the consulship of Valentinian and Valens, but when spring came and Gratian, who was as yet unknown to public life, succeeded to the highest magistracy with De Gallia for colleague, Valens mobilized his forces, joined Lupicinus and his strong army of auxiliaries, and marched quickly to Pessinnius, a town formerly in Phrygia but now in Galatia, leaving a garrison to guard against any surprise in that area. He advanced over difficult country along the foot of Mount Olympus towards Lydia, intending to attack Gomorius, who was lazing away there. He met, however, with widespread and obstinate resistance, chiefly because his enemy carried about with him in a litter Constantius' small daughter and her mother Faustina, not only on the march but even into the line of battle, and in this way excited his men to fight more resolutely for the imperial family, with which he claimed to be himself connected. Just so the Macedonians, on the eve of one of their battles with the Illyrians, placed their infant king in his cradle behind their line, and from fear that he might be captured, crushed their opponents with all the greater energy. To counter this clever move and bolster his tottering cause, the emperor adopted a wise expedient. He urged the ex-consul Arbitio, who had long been in retirement, to come to him, in the hope that respect for one of Constantine's generals would abate the insolence of the rebels. He was not disappointed. Arbitio was everybody's senior in age and rank. He showed his venerable white head, calling Procopius a public enemy, but addressing his deluded followers, among whom were many potential deserters, as his own sons and partners in his early labours. He begged them to follow him, who they knew to be successful, like a father, rather than obey a worthless profligate who deserved to be abandoned and must shortly fall. When he heard of this, Gemorius, who might have given his enemies the slip and returned unharmed to his base, preferred to take advantage of the proximity of the emperor's camp to desert to him, pretending that he had been surprised by the sudden appearance of a large force and had been taken prisoner. Heartened by this, Valens advanced into Phrygia, and the two armies joined battle near Nicolia. While the issue was still undecided, Agilio turned the scale by suddenly changing sides. He was followed by many others who, in the very act of brandishing their pikes and swords, deserted to the emperor, holding their standards and shields reversed, which is a sure sign of defection. This totally unexpected event robbed Procopius of any hope of safety. He took to flight and hid in the recesses of the surrounding woods and mountains, accompanied by Florentius and the tribune Barcalba, who had won renown in the fiercest wars from the time of Constantius, and had been led into treason by necessity rather than inclination. The greater part of the night had passed, lightened by a moon which shone brightly from its first rising until dawn, and intensified Procopius's fears. All chance of escape was cut off. He was at his wit's end and sunk into despair. While he was bitterly reproaching fortune for his troubles, as men do in such straits, he was suddenly seized by his companions. At daybreak, they took him to the camp and handed him over, silent and stupefied, to the emperor. He was immediately beheaded, and so stilted the rising storm of civil war. His fate was that of Perperna, who killed Sertorius at table and enjoyed a brief spell of power, but was then dragged from the thickets where he was hiding, brought before Pompey, and put to death at his orders. In the prevailing mood of anger, which allowed no time for reflection, Florentius and Barbalca, who had surrendered Procopius, were also at once put to death. If they had betrayed their lawful emperor, justice herself could have found no fault with their execution, but, since their victim was generally acknowledged to be a rebel who had disturbed the peace of the realm, they ought to have been generously rewarded for a notable service. Procopius was 40 years and 10 months old when he died. He was tall and not bad-looking, though he stooped and kept his eyes to the ground as he walked. His austere and reserved character was like that of the Crassus who, according to Lucullus and Cicero, only once laughed in his life. A remarkable thing about him was that he went through life innocent of bloodshed. The usurper, whose complex career and death I have described, was still living when on the 21st of July, in the first consulship of Valentinian and his brother, a frightful disaster, surpassing anything related either in legend or authentic history, overwhelmed the whole world. Day had just dawned when, after a thunderstorm of exceptional violence, the solid frame of the earth shuddered and trembled, and the sea was moved from its bed and went rolling back. The abyss of the deep was laid open, various types of marine creatures could be seen stuck in the slime, and huge mountains and valleys which had been hidden since the creation in the depths of the waves then, one must suppose, saw the light of the sun for the first time. Many ships were stranded on what was now dry land, and a host of people roamed at large in the shallows that were left to pick up fish and similar objects. Then, however, the roaring sea, as if indignant at its repulse, turned back, and rushed over the seething shoals to burst in a fury upon islands and wide tracts of the mainland. Innumerable buildings in towns, or wherever they were standing, were levelled to the ground, and the whole face of the earth was changed by this mad conflict of the elements, and revealed wonderful sights. The sudden return of the vast sea when it was least expected drowned many thousands. When the watery element again subsided, many ships had been destroyed by the force of the tidal wave, and the dead bodies of the shipwrecked crews were left lying on their backs or faces. Other great vessels, hurled along by the raging winds, landed on the roofs of buildings, as happened at Alexandria, and some were carried nearly 2 miles inland, like the Laconian ship which I saw myself during a journey near Mothone, gaping at the seams from long decay.